Michael Drayton suffered a catastrophic and permanent professional setback after his 1603 publication of To the Majestie of King James, a gratulatory poem, failed to win the ascendant monarch's favor. Scholarship has been muddled on the question of why the seemingly laudatory poem drew such ire from the king, and critical overall of Drayton's political writings, claiming that works such as the Owle, the Moone-Calfe, and Poly-Olbion are sluggish and dull and demonstrate no talent. Today, many scholars accept that Drayton's lack of success under James can be accounted for by the fact that he was a mediocre writer, or perhaps that he was simply oblivious to social and political mores. However, an examination of Drayton's full corpus reveals a covert narrative of political martyrdom. Years after the Majestie of King James fiasco, Drayton proudly asserts that he willingly sacrificed his status in favor of personal integrity, when cowardice had tied up every tongue and all stood silent. To the end of his days, Drayton retained the high regard of his fellow poets, particularly Ben Jonson, whose epitaph for Drayton in Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner exhorts the marble to "Let thy readers know what they and what their children owe to Drayton's name, protect his memory, and preserve his story." Unfortunately, I don't think that Drayton's memory has been protected, as he is mocked daily by no less than the Westminster Abbey website. They rebut Jonson's epitaph with the sassy retort. However, Drayton's fame did not last, as poet Oliver Goldsmith, visiting the Abbey just a century later, exclaimed, "Drayton? I've never heard of him before." In this talk, I will attempt to reconstruct Drayton's fall from grace from an Oxfordian perspective, identifying the subversive political message in To the Majestie of King James and the reference to Shakespeare in the Owle, culminating with the proposal that the virtuous friend that's dead Drayton alludes to in his address to Master George Sandys might just be Edward de Vere. When Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, something strange happened. Though the common people mourned her, there was a conspicuous lack of eulogies from England's leading poets, particularly ones with connections to government and aristocratic patronage. Henry Chettle called out the cowardice of Elizabeth's poets for not praising her after her death in his publication, England's Mourning Garment. "The funeral hastens on of that sometimes most serene lady, and yet I see none, or at least past one or two that have sung anything since her departure worth the hearing. And of them, they that are bestable scarce remember her majesty." He quotes Spenser, "Being dead, no poet seeks him to revive, though many poets flattered him alive." Henry Chettle had a track record of taking risks for the sake of political expression, and he reprimands a long list of poets for failing to mourn Elizabeth, including Samuel Daniel, George Chapman, Ben Jonson, Thomas Dekker, and John Marston. Why were all of these poets silent? Despite public appearances, anyone close to the crown knew that King James was not a fan of Queen Elizabeth. James had refused to go to Elizabeth's funeral or wear black, and had instead visited Sir Oliver Cromwell to attend a wild, lavish party, boasting such entertainment as the like had not been seen in any place before. The Venetian ambassador reported home that James wishes to see her neither alive nor dead, for he can never expel from his memory the fact that his mother was put to death at the hands of the public execution with great disgrace and cruelty. So there were obviously some hard feelings. In this charged climate, poet Michael Drayton steps first when everyone else is scared to go in the water, publishing To the Majestie of King James, a gratulatory poem, which for some reason goes over like a lead balloon. Many scholars have repeated the idea that Drayton offended King James with his poem because it praises James without offering appropriate mourning and respect to the late Queen Elizabeth. But I think we know that's not the case. However, it's much more likely that James was offended by the closing passage in Drayton's otherwise innocuous and flattering poem, which begs him to banish the fool, the pander, and the parasite from his court. In fact, it almost feels as though the whole praise poem was just a pretense to share that very message. I'm not going to linger on it, but I'll gently propose that the fool, the pander, and the parasite might be who James affectionately referred to as his trinity of knaves: Robert Cecil, Thomas Howard, and Henry Howard. I found it interesting that Earl Showerman suggested that Henry Howard was one model for Pandarus in Troilus and Cressida, so it's perhaps he is the pander, but I think Robert Cecil is more likely to be the parasite than the fool. However, I will leave it to others to sort this out. Writing this poem basically destroys Drayton's career for the rest of his life, but he doesn't go away quietly. In 1604, he publishes The Owl, a beast fable, which critics and historians have completely misunderstood and largely dismissed as a mild satire. I personally think of Drayton's satires more as Jeremiads. These are morally outraged cries of warning and condemnation to those who are complicit in the horrors perpetrated by James and his cronies. And indeed, Drayton often invokes the biblical prophets. In this poem, Drayton is the titular protagonist. And as the owl, he talks about how he stuck his neck out and all the other birds tore him violently to shreds. King James is also referred to repeatedly as the kingly eagle throughout the poem. All the birds of the forest band together to brutalize the owl, and the owl then laments a world perverted and gone wrong. Justice, say they, ah, whither art thou fled? Or this vile world hast thou abandoned? Oh, why, fair virtue, wert thou made in vain? Freedom is lost, and liberty is slain. In a later section, the kingly eagle actually sticks up for the owl and his right to free speech, which was clearly a wish expressed by Drayton. The eagle now, a serious ear that lent to the religious and devout intent of the good owl, whom too injurious fate had thus rewarded, doth commiserate the poor distressed bird, hoping to hear what all the rest through negligence or fear smothered in silence and had buried still. Covering the sore of many a festered ill, not only grants him liberty of speech, but further deigning kindly to beseech the virtuous bird no longer to refrain, who thus emboldened by his sovereign, at length his silence resolutely brake, and thus the eagle's majesty bespake. A modern critic was disappointed by Drayton's descriptions of birds, as he betrays no more than common knowledge of birds. However, I think Drayton's choice to use birds for his poem might have had other advantages. There was, in fact, an active dissident discourse happening around bird fables. In 1601, another controversial bird fable had been published in Love's Martyr, with prefatory poems from Jonson, Chapman, and Marston. I'm referring to William Shakespeare's The Phoenix and the Turtle, which has been interpreted as an allegory about Queen Elizabeth and a lover, possibly de Vere, as the parents of a hidden Prince Tudor. Sure enough, the phoenix and the turtle are here in the very climax of Drayton's poem. To the secret of all secrets when I came, having my eyes even glued with grief and shame, I tell not how the vulture fate apart, spending the blood and marrow of his heart, and by all means his faculties to apply, to taint the phoenix by his circadry. That of her kind she had been more than one, parent and infant to herself alone. This heavenly bird, in touching their defame, had had her purple soiled with their shame, and for the turtle would not be unchaste. Her did they banish to the barren waste. Another convenient feature of using birds is that it allows Drayton to reference Henry Parrott, a notorious spy also referenced in Ben Jonson's poem Inviting a Friend to Supper. Into a chamber very richly dight, where sat the vulture with a dreadful frown, proud and ambitious, gaping for renown, his talons red with blood of murdered fowls. His full eye quickly every way controls, which when this parrot steadfastly beheld, his feathers bristled and his stomach swelled, and to the vulture openeth where he sat, whose ears attentive listening still thereat, the state and havior of each private man, laid out for searching avarice to scan. Now I'm going to jump about 2 decades ahead to the publication of Drayton's poem to his friend George Sandys. It's in a collection that comes out in 1627, after the death of King James, but the writings in it were mostly composed around 1621. The opening lines of the poem refer to the recent disaster in Bohemia, where James I's daughter Elizabeth and her husband have been exiled after just 1 year on the throne. Henry de Vere, 18th Earl of Oxford, is going to be imprisoned soon for opposing the Spanish match, and he will be suspected of wanting to lead an uprising with the purpose of placing the popular Princess Elizabeth on the English throne instead of her father James. After mentioning the recent news from the Palatinate, Drayton's poem turns to the past. I scarce dare praise a virtuous friend that's dead, lest for my lines he should be censured. It was my hap that before all other men to suffer shipwreck from my forward pen. When King James entered, at which joyful time I taught his title to this isle in rhyme. When cowardice had tied up every tongue, and all stood silent, yet for him I sung. And when before by danger I was dared, I kicked her from me, nor a jot I spared. Drayton speaks of his tribulations that year. He next, my God, on whom I built my trust, had left me trodden lower than the dust. But let this pass. In the extremest ill, Apollo's brood must be courageous still. Apollo's brood are artists, and Drayton now returns to his bird allegory. Let pies and daws sit dumb before their death, only the swan sings at the parting breath. The rest of the long poem is a complaint, lamenting how, poetically speaking, giants once walked the earth, but now, around the world, the great poets are forgotten. That famous Greece, where learning flourished most, hath of her muses long since left to boast. The unlettered Turk and rude barbarian trades, where Homer sang his lofty Iliads. Drayton then turns to England. Base balladry is so beloved and sought, and those brave numbers are put by for naught, which rarely read were able to awake bodies from graves and to the ground to shake. That but I know, ensuing ages shall raise her again who now is in her fall, and out of dust reduce our scattered rhymes, the rejected jewels of these slothful times. Drayton closes his poem wishing his friend, the poet George Sandys, well at Sandys's post in the New Virginia colony, and he seems to regard the New World as potentially hopeful frontier for both man and for letters, despite the moral rot that has overtaken Europe. I wanted to validate whether or not the virtuous friend who Drayton didn't feel comfortable naming could be De Vere or not, and it's of course impossible to nail it down for certain. It's certainly possible that it's any other unnamed virtuous friend who had died more recently, but Drayton's extensive rumination on the decline of English letters, as well as his relationship with De Vere, led me to think it could be De Vere. Obviously, virtuous is a Vere word, and I wasn't sure if George Sandys might have had any context for knowing about Shakespeare or Edward de Vere, so I did a little research. As it turns out, George Sandys would have been well acquainted with Shakespeare and the authorship controversy, because just by reading Henry Wriothesley's Wikipedia page, you can see easily that George Sandys and his brother Edwin Sandys were both close allies of Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton, on the board of the Virginia Company. Researching Michael Drayton, I felt that he has been treated very unfairly by posterity. He was a man of integrity, called honest by Henry Peacham, and at his death, though he was broke, the line of mourners stretched for many blocks. Whether or not De Vere is referenced in Drayton's poem, I believe that Drayton deserves more credit than he has been given as a man of integrity and a courageous member of Apollo's brood who upheld the maxim that nothing is truer than truth. I'd like to add an afterthought, which is that I've been corresponding with Heidi Jansch, and she's been researching the theory that De Vere was referred to by his allies in secret with a code name where they would refer to him as friend. Jansch has found multiple examples of this usage, and I think this Michael Drayton poem could be a part of this broader pattern, which is intriguing. It's cool thinking about Edward de Vere as having had a secret code name amongst his Confederates. So I'm looking forward to reading Heidi's upcoming article on this topic, and thank you so much for watching.